you, I think, have worried a lot about household debt. So can you maybe tell us a little bit more about why do we make a distinction between these types of debt, public debt, household debt, and corporate debt, and what are the differences between them?
Yes, it is right to pay a lot of attention to public debt, and even to the extent that when you read in the Financial Times or in newspaper coverage about debt, just debt, what is typically meant is public debt, not private debt. So you really need to pay attention to that, because private debt is bigger than public debt in most countries. So adding up household debt and companies' debt is more than public debt only. Mm-hmm. The reason that so many investors focus on the public debt is that they've put their money in bonds, which is in public bonds, which is government debt. So this is the metric they are watching. And the second reason is that if a country cannot borrow anymore, so if it cannot issue bonds and finds parties to buy it, that of course would be a disaster for the country. Whereas if some private party cannot borrow anymore, that would probably still be manageable by the government stepping in and supporting the companies, banks, for instance. But the private sector will not easily step in and support the government when the government is in problems, because the private sector thinks that is much too risky, but it's the government's job to handle the risk. So that there is an asymmetry there. Public debt is at the top of the hierarchy of how important debt is for the survival of the country. Mm-hmm. Having said that, I think it's a big mistake to focus on public debt and to urge that public debt should be reduced, and not to pay attention to private debt, because that can be just as dangerous. Actually, the 2007 great financial crisis, the greatest financial crisis ever, was a private debt crisis. There was no public debt problem there.
Although lots of governments got into a lot of trouble, specifically, and this is no coincidence, as I'm sure you will explain to us, in Europe. So Spain, Greece got mostly into trouble there.
But that's because they needed to. Yeah, this is so the government debt levels of Spain and Greece and Italy. Well, Greece is the exception, but Spain and Italy, the big EU economies, were not worryingly high before the great financial crisis, but they shot up as they were supporting their banks, getting into debt in order to keep their banking systems and their financial systems running. And then when they had to shoulder the cost of the recessions that follows, so the cause was private debt growth, which the government let happen, of course. This is not without the implication of the government, but it was not government borrowing by itself that led to the crisis, but government borrowing increased after the crisis as they had to shoulder the cost of keeping the economy going when the private financial sector collapsed.
Yeah, and why did this sort of blow up specifically in Europe? Because I think Japan also did this. I think, well, you can also tell me if I'm wrong there, but I think China will start doing this. But in Europe they did it, and it was a problem. Whereas in Japan, most famously not.
Yeah, this is because of the unique relation in Europe between the central bank and government. So in the US, for instance, which was of course very seriously hit by the 2007 financial crisis, the government bought up a lot of bad assets, a lot of the debts that were not going to be repaid, so-called cash for trash programs. And this was funded by the Federal Reserve without a problem. So nobody ever doubted that the American government would be able to finance itself, would be able to issue bonds and to have them bought up. Also because the dollar is the world's money. That's another factor. Mm-hmm. In Europe, during the Euro crisis, so 2007 and 8 was the credit crisis in the United States. Then 2008, 9, and 10, it blew over to Europe. And then from 2010 to 15 was the Euro crisis. That's really a separate phase in this global crisis. And this is when international investors started doubting that, for instance, Italy or Spain would still be able to issue bonds and find parties to buy it, so that it would be safe to hold these bonds because you could always sell them. They were assets that you could turn into money. So that means that the liquidity of the bond markets for Italian and Spanish bonds was decreasing, and therefore the interest rates on them were rising. Investors wanted to be compensated more for holding the bonds. And who had to pay these high interest rates were, of course, the Italian state and the Spanish state and so on. And so it got to the point where, given the levels of debt that these states by now had, they also had to pay very high interest rates on their debts. And this was going to be unsustainable unless the central bank, their own central bank, the European Central Bank, stepped in and said, well, if no private party wants to buy those bonds, we will always buy them. Not directly maybe, but from private investors, and later on also directly. And at the moment, the European Central Bank, Mario Draghi, who was then the president, said this, we will do whatever it takes. From that moment, interest rates went down again because investors were reassured. Yeah. So that's a big difference between Europe and other countries which have their own central banks. So Italy and Spain don't have their own central bank.
So you're saying that when Italy and Spain sort of temporarily got their own central bank, immediately there wasn't a problem anymore.
That's right.
Yeah. And so this got me basically wondering, like, okay, if you look at these kind of debt levels, the main focus is often on government debt, but for many advanced economies, at least, that are not in a currency peg or a euro type of arrangement, it's not the most important thing you should look at. Private debt is more important as a metric for sort of unsustainable asset bubbles. But should we also make a distinction then between corporate and household debt, or can we just look at private debt in general?
No, we should make a distinction between corporate and private debt. So just one step back, we should look at total debt, which is public debt plus private debt. And the reason is, just a quick recap, is that if private debt is too high and private companies and households get into problems, the government will have to step in and take over that debt so that the government debt will increase. So it's no good to say the government debt is low and the private debt is very high, but it's no problem because the government debt is so low. The government debt will rise if there is a private debt crisis. That's almost automatically the case. So you have to add them up and then look at the whole picture. Mm-hmm. But after you've added them up, you should take them apart again because they are different dynamics. So we've just covered differences between the government and the private sector, and within the private sector, the difference between companies and households is, very roughly speaking, is that most household debts in many countries are mortgage debt. So they are not debts which will increase the economy's production. They are mostly used to trade existing housing assets. A little bit also for building, but on the total stock of housing, that is a small amount. So by and large, the growth in mortgage debt will just increase house prices and not do much for the economy's activity, except for consumption of those who own housing. And therefore, mortgage debt and household debt more generally is quite a dangerous asset class because it's not used in a productive way. Mm-hmm. It's used for consumption and it increases asset values, but it's not used for production and generating incomes. And so again, the question is, where will the income be to repay this debt? Company debt is different. Companies can also use debt in unproductive ways, and they do. But for a large part, company debt is debt that is used productively. They borrow in order to invest in capital goods, in machinery and robots and so on. And that will actually grow the economy, create employment, and create the incomes, profit and wages from which debt can be repaid. So company debt is not so dangerous as household debt.
So if you do a case study, look at a country, something that we have, for example, done in when we used to teach courses together, you will look at debt to GDP first. Is it super high or not? That if it is, that might be a fragile economy. Then, I'm just guessing here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but then you would look at household debt and maybe in combination with asset prices. Then you would look at government debt, depending on whether or not it's in what type of monetary system it is. So for Europe, it's more risky.
Well, yes, that is one thing. Another thing is also, what access does the government have to funding and who is the counterparty of that debt? For instance, Japan has a very high public debt, and also Italy, but a lot of it is held by its own citizens. And it's more dangerous when the government's debt is held by foreign parties. In the first place, if it's held in a different currency, then it means that this government or this country needs to earn that currency by exporting, for instance, so that they can repay the debt. And if they cannot export enough, that might be a problem. Mm-hmm. But in the second place, foreign creditors, foreign investors might demand their money back by wanting to sell the bonds. And that's not as big a problem with domestic investors, by households and firms who hold the government debt. So this is why Japan, which has a very high public debts, has no public debt problem.
Yeah. But that always gets me wondering, like, if we talk about Japan, it might not have a public debt problem, or it clearly doesn't. Interest rates aren't that high on government debt. Inflation is very low. However, and this maybe we're getting into MMT territory a little bit, modern monetary theory, that is. And the perception that people have of that, which is often different than what it actually says. But a question that comes to mind is, how high can government debt then go? And I don't think anybody knows exactly. But do you think that the limit to government debt is inflation? So government debt can go as high as it, whatever, until you see inflation. I think that's one of the takeaways from MMT, at least.
Well, that you would have to ask to an MMT person. I don't think they would agree. But what you're saying here is that higher government debt at some point leads to inflation.
Mm-hmm.
That's the so-called fiscal deficit theory of inflation.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think that's correct. There can be inflation for other causes than rising government debt.
Sure. Yep.
So I would decouple this question, how high can government debt be, from the question, is there inflation?
Okay.
It might be the case that excessive government spending is leading to inflation, but there's a number of other possible causes. And I don't think you can put a number on saying this is the level of debt that's going to be dangerous. There was a very famous academic study years ago which tried to do that. Around 90-100%, I think, was the turning point that they apart from the mistakes in that study, this would be a grand average for many different countries. And it depends on what the credit standing of the country is. So how much access does it have to new borrowing? It depends on its export capacity, if it's foreign debt or domestic currency debt. So it really depends on too many structurally very different factors to give one number and say this has to apply to any country.